20 bicarbs to every CO2, we're going to have a pH of 7.4, and that's normal pH in your extracellular fluid. So anytime that reaction goes toward the right, you are becoming acidotic. Anytime this reaction goes toward the left, you're becoming alkaline. Okay? So, now this is what we went through that last day, that yes, your respiratory system regulates CO2. The partial pressure of CO2, the partial pressure of arterial CO2 is determined by your alveolar CO2, and alveolar CO2 is determined by alveolar ventilation. The faster you ventilate, if I just stand here and go, if I hyperventilate, I'm going to be exhaling CO2 faster than my metabolism is producing it. Therefore, my increased ventilation is going to cause a decrease, my increase in ventilation is going to cause a decrease in alveolar CO2, and alveolar CO2 and arterial CO2 are normally equal in a healthy individual. So, if I hyperventilate, the amount of CO2 in the bloodstream goes down and I become alkalotic. So, and it goes the other direction. If you hypoventilate, CO2 accumulates in the bloodstream and you become acidotic. Okay, so we've already talked about that. So hyperventilation ultimately decreases arterial CO2 and increases pH. You become alkalotic. Hypoventilation ultimately, and it's really within seconds, increases arterial CO2 and will cause a decrease in pH, which is acidosis. So anytime your respiratory system is the primary cause of a pH imbalance, then it's a respiratory problem. So you can have some type of suppression of your respiratory centers leading to respiratory acidosis. If you chronically hypoventilate, that will generate respiratory acidosis. But if for some reason you are hyperventilating, if you are breathing faster than the metabolic needs of your body, that can generate a respiratory alkalosis. So the respiratory system can be a primary driver of pH problems in these cases, but the respiratory system can also help you compensate for pH. So this is if you're something wrong with your respiratory system. But what if something is causing a pH imbalance in the body? Well, the respiratory system can come to the rescue. If for some reason you have a metabolic acidosis, a lot of different ways of getting a metabolic acidosis. Some people, you will have patients that will be drinking 4 and 5 liters of Diet Coke a day. They're taking in a lot. They're ingesting a lot of acid. They're generating a metabolic acidosis. Well, the respiratory system can compensate for that respiratory acidosis, that metabolic, acidosis by a maneuver that would normally cause just the opposite, a respiratory alkalosis. They hyperventilate. If you go out and you swim 200 meters really, really hard, that creates a metabolic acidosis. Guess what? You compensate by hyperventilation. People who have terrible diarrhea, when somebody has terrible diarrhea, you're actually losing a lot of bicarb with the diarrhea. That creates a metabolic acidosis. Well, a person hyperventilates to keep their pH in that 7.4 range. Goes the other direction. There's some people that just eat Tums, calcium carbonate, just all the time because they think they have indigestion. Sometimes they actually have a heart problem. So one can have a metabolic alkalosis. So how do you compensate? How does the respiratory system help to make that right? You hyperventilate, you build up CO2. So there's a lot of different ways of keeping that balance right. Now, let's take just a couple minutes to look at how do the kidneys
You meant hypoventilating, right?
Oh, did I, sorry if I, yeah, you hypoventilate, I'm sorry.
No, you're good.
If you have a metabolic alkalosis. So hypoventilation normally would cause a respiratory acidosis, and a respiratory acidosis maneuver will help compensate for a metabolic alkalosis. So the compensation, you just basically think of what would be the opposite, and you do that maneuver. Now with the kidneys, getting to where we finished off last time, your kidneys regulate bicarbonate. And this is a very important page right here.
No.
Okay, what page number is that? Page one of that. Okay, yeah, okay, it's that top panel. So up here, so yes, A, the respiratory system regulates CO2, the renal system regulates bicarbonate. Now B is, what's the renal compensation for respiratory acidosis? Having too much arterial CO2. That's what B is. C is the renal compensation for respiratory alkalosis. Okay. So how does the kidneys compensate if you have too much? Let's say you have a respiratory problem. You have some type of, maybe you've had damage to your brainstem and you've lost some of your respiratory drive. So you're not ventilating fast enough. What if you have diffusion problems? You have some situation where you have tremendous thickening of the barrier for diffusion at the lung. You're definitely going to see patients with that. And you're going to, and that person, that patient has a pulmonary diffusion impairment. Well, maybe they can't get rid of their CO2. But bottom line is, CO2 is building up in the bloodstream, so the primary problem is a respiratory acidosis. How can the kidneys help keep pH closer to normal? Number one, you'll want to reabsorb your filtered bicarb. We talked about there's so many things that are freely filterable. Glucose, alanine, lactate, water-soluble vitamins. There's so many of these good molecules that what does the kidney do? It reabsorbs those good molecules and put them back into the bloodstream. Well, bicarbonate is freely filterable. It's freely filterable. So, if you have a respiratory acidosis going on, you definitely want to hold on to whatever base you have, bicarbonate you have in circulation. You don't want to lose it in the urine, right? So, first thing is any filtered bicarbonate, let's reabsorb it. Second thing, the kidneys can make new bicarb and add more bicarb to the bloodstream. That's going to help compensate for that elevated CO2, get you closer to that 20 bicarbs to 1 CO2 balance. And you can also eliminate protons via the urine. All of those will help compensate that respiratory acidosis. Now these slides are just scary as all get out because it seems like there's a lot of stuff going on, but you take this equation one step at a time and it turns out, oh, this is really, really simple. So these slides are looking at how do we reabsorb filtered bicarbonate. So here's the lumen of that nephron, here's our tubular cell. Now these mechanisms for that I just mentioned, they occur primarily in the proximal tubule and in the distal tubule. In the proximal tubule and distal tubule. That's where reabsorption, production, and excretion that I was just mentioning take place. So here we're in the proximal tubule or we're in the distal tubule. Why? Well, it turns out this is where we have a lot of carbonic anhydrase. And carbonic anhydrase is what drives this carbonic anhydrase reaction. So we have a lot of carbonic anhydrase. So here we have bicarbonate in the lumen of our nephron. So let's say we're in the proximal tubule. We're in the proximal tubule. Bicarb was filtered. Water is filtered. CO2 is filtered. They're freely filterable. But what was the primary problem? We have a respiratory acidosis. We have too much CO2 in the bloodstream. So guess what? There's elevated CO2 here in the fluid within the nephron. Well, that elevated CO2 is going to jumpstart or kickstart this process. That CO2 is going to be able to come into the tubular cell. We have this carbonic anhydrase inside cells in the proximal tubule and distal tubule. And it will this carbonic acid will dissociate into a bicarbonate and a proton. Kind of go, well, how's this helping us with bicarb? Not yet. Well, we learned about countertransport in part 1 of this course. There are these sodium, hydrogen ion countertransport. The other term for countertransport is?
Antiport.
Antiport. There we go. So we have these transporters here in the luminal or apical membrane of the tubular cells, and sodium going down its concentration gradient is going to pump out that proton. Guess what? That proton can now react with that filtered bicarb, creating carbonic acid in here, which will break down to water and CO2. So here's the carbon. Now it's in this form, 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 now that bicarb gets reabsorbed. So we have to pump out protons to reabsorb the filtered bicarbonate. So isn't this kind of cool that the problem was too much CO2, and CO2 led to part of the solution. CO2 kicked this off to get this process going so we can pump out a proton so we can reabsorb the bicarb. So now the bicarbonate's been reabsorbed and put back into the bloodstream. So let's say this keeps going on, keeps going on, keeps going on, until you have reabsorbed all of the bicarbonate. But CO2 is still elevated. CO2 is still elevated. Well, guess what? This reaction can keep going. It can keep going. And what are you now doing? You are now producing a brand new bicarbonate. So, number one, you wanted to reabsorb all the filtered bicarb, and now we can produce new bicarb. And we're doing it from what was the problem? Too much CO2. So we're getting rid of some of the CO2 and making bicarbonate with it. But what on earth are we going to do with this proton? Well, that's step 3. We have a lot of phosphate in our circulation. So we can have urinary excretion of a proton by complexing it with, and don't worry if it's H2PO4H2. This might be in different things. You might see 4 minus, you might see a 3. Don't worry about that. The point is, because of that CO2, you can pump out this proton, and this can be released in the urine, a form of phosphoric acid. So guess what? When somebody is suffering any type of acidosis and you have this going on in your distal tubule and in your proximal tubule, the urine is going to become acidified. This is called titratable acid. There'll be titratable acid in the urine. It doesn't make it, incredibly acidic, but it does make the urine more and more acidic. Slightly acidic. Yeah.
So the water and the CO2 going into the cell?
Yeah, water's always, yes. Yeah, water's never, I didn't draw it in for water, but water can move in as needed.
But I just mean like that's the first step, and the bottom one's water, and then
Yes. Yeah, and all these, this is the first step, and it just keeps running this way. So it's really that carbonic anhydrase equation, believe it or not, in this case, it's moving from right to left. The way I had it written, it, you know, it was, well, excuse me. Yeah. This is moving in this case, be careful how I don't want to go there. I don't want to go there because it'll lead to some confusion later on. But this is still the same carbonic anhydrase equation, that it has the ability to move in either direction. In this case, the elevated CO2 is keeping it moving in this direction. We're reabsorbing bicarbonate, we're making new bicarbonate, we're pumping out protons. So, the kidneys are helping to compensate for a respiratory problem. Yes, Kim?
So can the carbonic acid not transfer from the lumen to the tubular cells in the carbonic acid form? It has to degrade down into water.
Now that's carbonic acid right there, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So can you not, so going back to
It
the carbonic
spontaneously breaks down.
It's spontaneous, okay.
The energy level, the stability level is such that it will immediately dissociate to its ions.
But what about like when he's over in the lumen?
Yes.
Why does it go from the carbonic acid to the water and CO2? Can that not be transported back into? Because
Oops.
that one right there, where he's
Yeah.
carbonic acid, then he breaks down to water and CO2.
Yeah. This was what, okay, so bicarb filtered, and we have elevated CO2.
So carbonic acid is formed as a result
Your-
of the elevated CO2.
The protons being pumped out, that is causing the creation. This is not fully filterable, as it turns out.
Okay, that's what I
Well,
heard.
it turns out there's not much in circulation.
Okay.
We have this in circulation, and we have these in circulation. Not much of that. We form this in red blood cells, we form this in these tubular cells. We form this in the stomach. It's how we make the protons for hydrochloric acid in the stomach. So, the respiratory system, when it's up and healthy, regulates CO2. The renal system, when it's up and healthy, regulates bicarbonate. And this is a whole area of biochem that I bet you never got into when you took biochem. But during chronic acidosis, your tubular cells will start metabolizing glutamine. And don't worry anything about other than it causes the generation of a bicarbonate, it causes the generation of ammonium. That's not ammonia. Ammonia is NH3. This is ammonium. And ammonium can be tubular secreted and then released into the urine. And that's another way of getting rid of a proton. And you need to know a lot of physiology and biochem to really understand why and how that takes place. Just know it takes place. That's good enough. That's more than good enough. So, what happens if we have the opposite situation? Let's say we have a respiratory alkalosis. We have a very low arterial CO2. Well, number one, and I didn't draw the picture of this, but we will have failure to reabsorb filtered bicarb. Remember, we needed to have that proton being pumped out, and that proton came from CO2, and if CO2 is low, we're not going to have the first step. We need to be pumping out protons to reabsorb filtered bicarb. So this number one really isn't going to happen because we're going to have very low tubular secretion of protons, and we need that to reabsorb bicarb. So if we have a respiratory alkalosis, guess what? Some of the filtered bicarb is just going to be lost in the urine. The urine is going to become alkalotic. And this is another thing that there's quite a few steps involved, but we can actually have, from the peritubular capillary, if we have a respiratory alkalosis going on, some of the bicarb, there is a gradient for it, and I'm not going to go into all the steps of it because it's pretty involved, but we can actually have tubular secretion of bicarb. So we can have loss of bicarbonate due to glomerular filtration and urinary excretion. We can have loss of bicarbonate due to tubular secretion and urinary excretion.
Mm.
So both of these, we don't have enough CO2 in the bloodstream, hey, then lower the bicarb. And that's going to try to keep things closer in balance. So go back, look at these teeter-totter things, and see, okay, we can get an acidosis either by metabolic causes or respiratory causes. We can have an alkalosis either by a respiratory cause or a metabolic cause. And remember, metabolic means non-respiratory. Metabolic means non-respiratory. So anything that's not being caused by CO2 is automatically termed metabolic. And these show the compensation. Metabolic acidosis can be compensated by something that would normally cause a respiratory alkalosis, so hyperventilation. A respiratory acidosis can be compensated by something that would normally cause a metabolic alkalosis, which is generating bicarb. And I already talked to you about the steps for evaluating pH problems, and you always go in this order. Look at pH, acidosis, alkalosis. Look at CO2. Is this derangement, can it be caused by CO2? And if not, it's metabolic. And then you look to see if compensation is occurring. So we stepped through some of these before. If any of you want to go through these again sometime, we'll do that. Okay, here's something that is going to be ground central to so much of what many of you are going to be doing, dealing with patients with diabetes. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at glycemic control and diabetes. So here's kind of some learning objectives. I want you to be able to explain what's diabetes, how prevalent is it in the population, what are the consequences of uncontrolled diabetes, what's glycemic control. You already have seen this in part one. It's homeostasis, homeostatic regulation of glucose. What is hyperglycemia, what's hypoglycemia, what's the consequences of either of those. I want you to be able to go back and be able to diagram the actions of what insulin's doing for glycemic control, what is glucagon doing for regulating glycemic control. I want you to be able to draw out the sensory effector, make the feedback loops. Definitely want you to be able to contrast and compare type 1, type 2 diabetes, what's similar, what's different, and then what, not mechanistically, but what you're going to see is poorly controlled diabetics have very poor wound healing, and they don't handle infections. They're susceptible to many different infections because their host response is not as good. And how does one assess long-term glycemic control? So if you are able to do these, and there's one other thing that I included right at the very end that we're going to kind of talk through. Hopefully we'll have time, because I really don't know how much background you guys have had in biochem. I know what it says on paper, but we'll need to talk through something. So here's a glucose molecule. Here's a glucose molecule. You know, nice molecule, does a lot of things for us. What does it do for us? Well, we can break it down by glycolysis, the TCA cycle electron transport to make ATP. Glucose is good. Well, we can take glucose and we can store it as glycogen. Stored energy is good. Store energy while you have it, and therefore you can utilize it later on. So glucose is good because we can store it in the form of glycogen for energy later on. Well, we can also convert glucose to ribose, and we need ribose for RNA, DNA, CoA molecules, NAD, FAD, all ATP, GTP, all sorts of molecules in the body need ribose, and we can make it from glucose. So glucose, man, it carries the load. It does a lot of work for us. Hey, we need glucose to make glycosaminoglycans that are absolutely essential for many connective tissues and extracellular matrix molecules. So glucose, it's a good guy. It's helping us do that. Many amino acids can utilize the carbon skeletons provided by glucose to help make the amino acids so we can make proteins, and proteins give us function. So, glucose, well, that's good. If we have excess glucose in circulation, we can convert them to fatty acids, which we can store as triacylglycerol. And while we all know being over fat is not so healthy, says a guy with fat around his middle, it is a strong selective advantage for our ancestors to be able to take during times of plenty, when there's a lot of food available, to store it away very, very efficiently, incredibly efficiently, is triacylglycerol. And so energy storage in a completely different form. We can take carbon skeletons from glucose to build phospholipids, important for every membrane in the body. And cholesterol has a bad name, but if we didn't have cholesterol, none of the cells in our body would work. But we can take glucose, metabolize it in a way to make acetyl-CoA, and from acetyl-CoA we can make cholesterol, and from that gives us membrane function and many, many different molecules, especially steroid hormones, we can make from cholesterol. So you know what? This is a partial list of what we can do with glucose molecules. So man, when you see all these jobs that glucose can do for us, at least myself, I'd say, well, more the merrier. A lot of glucose would be a good thing. Unfortunately, with anything good in life, too much can be bad. And that's what diabetes is. When you have too much of a good thing, in this case, it's too much glucose in circulation for too long. Too much glucose in circulation for too long. When this molecule opens up into its straight chain form, it forms what's called a free aldehyde, and unfortunately that free aldehyde is chemically reactive with certain amino acids in the body, and this glucose, one way that it can be detrimental is it can stick to those proteins, and the body either recognizes them as foreign, or those proteins become dysfunctional. So too much glucose, inappropriately elevated glucose, and by inappropriately I mean is let's say you had let's say you had a bagel, because I'm really hungry for this, bagel with strawberry jam and a glass of orange juice. That's a lot of glucose. And so after a meal, it is appropriate for glucose to be elevated, and then your body takes that glucose and puts it into cells. That's appropriate transient hyperglycemia. It's when you have inappropriately elevated prolonged hyperglycemia that can lead to problems, and that's what we're going to talk about. So, now I've already given you this next slide, so it's not going to take your breath away. But when I show this slide, even in CE courses with people that have been practicing, say, clinical dentistry on the medicine side, everybody knows this graph very well. But, you know, it's like, what is the prevalence of diabetes in this country? You hear in the newspaper all the time, there's an explosion of, whoa, of diabetes in this country. And this is being driven by type 2 diabetes. This huge increase is being driven by an increase in type 2 diabetes. And so when I show this to like high school students or first year dental students or hygiene students, you know, beginning students, they go, goodness gracious, what happened in 1997? Something bad happened that year. Well, type 2 diabetes generally takes a decade or decade and a half or 2 decades to develop. So it's what really happened here that led to that. And on a different slide, and I wish I would have brought it, I put in here, when were Pop-Tarts invented? Here, you know, was there the switch over to color television? No? Here. When did we suddenly have desktop computers? Well, here. When did we get laptop computers? All these different things where we've had a societal shift. You know, when did McDonald's sell, you know, their 1 billionth hamburger. Well, it was someplace in hell. We've had this societal shift in what we eat, how much we eat, and how physically active we are. And while, yes, there is a genetic component to type 2 diabetes, 80% of the development of this crisis, this public healthcare crisis in this country is due to environmental factors. And it's what was going on here that caused that to happen, okay? So, you know, let's say you go to Gateway Mall this weekend, and I'm not gonna say throw a rock, but let's say you throw a wiffle ball in any direction. Well, you have a very good, if you would throw 5 wiffle balls, you have a very good chance of hitting a diabetic. That's how common it is. You know, that's how common it is. So how common is it? Well, we're in this country right now, and the new numbers for 2015 have just been released. But look at this, 12% have diabetes. Now this would be type 1 and type 2 diabetes, okay, put together. But that's a lot of people, By the time you're looking at people, if we would go there with the mall walkers, most of the mall walkers are 65 years old, and we started throwing wiffle ball, we'd only have to throw 4, and we'd probably, well, if they're walking, there's a good chance it's even more than that in there. So you can see, and look at the prevalence of pre-diabetes, where there is some glucose dysregulation, and people over age of 20, it's fully 1/3 of the population. And over 65, it's half. You think this is gonna fall in your lap? Yes. Yes, it is. So what's the consequence of diabetes? And different ones of these are gonna pop up in different order in your notes, but adults with diabetes have heart disease death rates 2 to 4 times higher than adults without. Risk for stroke 2 to 4 times higher. It worsens the body's response and susceptibility to a wide variety of different infections. It is the leading cause of new cases of blindness in adults in this country. Leading cause of kidney failure, and we've already seen how many jobs the kidneys do for us. You lose your kidneys, you lose blood pressure control, you lose all sorts of things. 60 to 70% of people with diabetes have some form of nerve damage. And that nerve damage leads to peripheral sensation, abnormalities, but it also goes to problems with the stomach. Carpal tunnel syndrome, who would have thought that? Rectal dysfunction, other nerve problems, so on and so forth. 30% of people with diabetes 40 years have impaired sensation in one area of the body. 60% of non-traumatic lower limb amputations. So the majority of non-traumatic, meaning non-car accident type amputations, is due to or occur in people with diabetes. Now, poorly controlled diabetes before conception and during the first trimester in women with type 1 diabetes is a contributor to birth defects and miscarriages. And in poorly controlled diabetics, whether it's type 1 or type 2, in the second, third trimesters, there's very increased risk for having a very large baby that is a risk to both the child and the mother. So diabetes is bad stuff, man. And people with diabetes twice as likely to have depression. Well, you read this list and you become depressed. Periodontal disease, I have to have something for the dental students, far more. It's somebody with diabetes. Now this is interesting with periodontal disease to me, because diabetes makes a periodontal disease much worse, but you treat the periodontal disease, diabetes gets better. You treat a person's gum disease, their glycemic control gets better. So I agree. Okay, and many susceptible to many other illnesses. So at the exit interviews and exit surveys with our dental students, right before we had accreditation 2 years ago, one of the students in one of their D4 assessments of the effectiveness of the dental curriculum had a response that I thought was absolutely golden. His or her response, I have no idea who said it, said, "We get it. Diabetes is bad." And they're just hammered with this throughout the curriculum. And because having a diabetic patient in the chair, if you're in oral health care, changes what you can do with that patient, how long you can have them in the chair. It changes all sorts of things. It changes their wound healing. There's some procedures that they need to get a medical consult and then get a medical clearance before they can do to relieve them of liability. So it's all sorts of things. Diabetes is bad. So now, I should have had this up and running. Now, we just had breakfast, so what's the consequences of uncontrolled diabetes? Well, a lot of different things, but poor wound and tissue healing is very, very much part of some of the challenges that poorly controlled diabetics have. And there's this dysregulation of inflammation. So poor wound healing, tissue healing, altered responses to infections, and dysregulation of inflammation are central to most diabetic complications. There's impaired angiogenesis, that means formation of new blood vessels, impaired immunity, and impaired blood vessel and tissue repair. So you never know what Google images are going to pull up. Okay, good morning.
Oh yeah, I've seen this.
That's a diabetic ulcer, that's a diabetic ulcer, it starts with something this little and leads to something like that. Now, why is that? Why is that? Now, in a normal healthy person, when we are just walking, we don't even think about it, but there is micro damage to our microvasculature all the time. It's happening all the time, and guess what? We heal. We heal. In a well-controlled diabetic, they heal too. In a poorly controlled diabetic, it's like, man, I keep hearing about toes and feet being amputated in diabetics. What's so wrong with the toes and feet? Nothing wrong with the toes and feet. It's that we are bipeds and we're bipedal. So we can damage our feet very easily, even though we don't know it. So if we walked on all fours, we'd have ulcerations in our hands too. But we have these gravity-dependent, micro-damaged areas that once they start, and then you can get an infection, and the healing's poor, angiogenesis is poor, and well, you can see all these feet are popping up here. Woo! Some of these kind of take your breath away a little bit. Okay, so that is going on. How about looking at the back of people's eyes? So the back of your eye, that's where your retina, that's where your cones and rods, sensory receptors are.
Well, that looks different.
Okay, so let's look at a normal eye. Here, well, that one's not quite. This one's pretty much normal right here. You see nice intact blood vessels. There might be an exudate there, but you don't see too many patchy areas. Now let's just go to something any of us can see is really bad. Here, the blood vessels are broken and there's hemorrhage.
Shoot.
And you see these white exudates. These are scar-type tissue. And you don't see that in the good-looking eye, but you definitely see areas of hemorrhage. And these exudates really form where you've had hemorrhage previously, and now you don't have new blood vessel formation going in, so you develop this scar-like tissue. And that's what diabetic vision starts looking like, because you have these exudates in here. Sometimes it's really good. And there's another image of what it might look like. Whoa, that's a big blowout right there.
Shoot.
And there's just what it might look like. Well, you don't see too many patchy areas. Now let's just go to something one that sometimes pops up that's really good. So that's normal vision, and here is really getting toward end-stage diabetic retinopathy. So one more thing is, let's look at the kidneys here. So here is a glomerulus. So here's glomerular capillaries, here's Bowman's capsule. So here's those podocytes, and this is where glomerular filtration takes place. And we can see nice, thin glomerular capillaries. Uh-oh, the walls of these capillaries are very, very thick. So here we have some, definitely some, well, diabetic nephropathy, and this is glomerular nephritis and amyloidosis here. So there's a sclerosis going on. So do you think you have this huge problem with kidney function? Absolutely, absolutely. That I would be shocked if that nephron's working at that point. It's probably been knocked out. So now, what are the mechanisms of this damage? There's two primary mechanisms of this hyperglycemic damage that you see in a poorly controlled diabetic. A lot of diabetics out there are very well controlled, very well managed. But let's say you have this inappropriate hyperglycemia going on. So one thing that can happen is this inappropriate glycation, and it's also called glycosylation, glycosylation. It leads to the formation of, you're going to hear about these forever, AGEs, advanced glycated end products or advanced glycation end products. But so sometimes you'll see glycated, sometimes you'll see glycosylation here. They mean the same thing. And what it is when one of those sugar molecules, its reactive aldehyde, will stick to a certain protein. And that is going to lead either to dysfunctional protein, or unfortunately the body recognizes that protein as damaged, and then you get inflammation by the body's surveillance cells to get rid of what it's seen as damaged tissue. This is just an example of this is one of many different examples of what happens when you have this sticking of glucose molecules inappropriately to cells throughout the body, including your blood vessels. Well, what can happen is LDL, low density lipoprotein cholesterol particles, will start to accumulate within vascular membranes, leading to inflammation and accelerating atherosclerosis. The development of plaque, fatty plaques within the walls of blood vessels. And this is one reason why heart disease is 2 to 4 times more rapidly progressing in a diabetic than a non-diabetic. So this inappropriate glycosylation of proteins throughout the body is one mechanism. The other is disturbances in polyol metabolism. And you don't have this picture, but so let's say inside of a cell we have a lot of glucose. If glucose is very, very high, here is an enzyme that normally does not react with glucose, aldose reductase, but if glucose is so high, it will overcome the affinity problems, and this reductase, unfortunately, will form sorbitol. Now, sorbitol in chewing gum or candy or xylitol, they're called sugar alcohols. They're used for artificial sweeteners, and they are actually quite safe because you get the sensation of sweetness, but they're not absorbed in the body, they pass out through the body. But when sorbitol, or any of them, when they're formed inside of a cell, that's a metabolic dead end. We don't have any enzymes to get rid of this in a cell once we make it. And what functional group do we see on sorbitol? About a bunch of OH groups. What molecule do you think OH groups attract? Water. So sorbitol attracts water to it. So if you have a cell that makes a little sorbitol, probably no problem. But what if it makes more and more? And once you make it, it stays in that cell forever. You have no mechanism of getting rid of it. What if sorbitol accumulates? It's going to accumulate water in that cell. What's going to happen? The cell's going to swell. You have cellular edema, and it's going to lead to osmotic cell injury. That cell is probably going to swell and burst. This is a major mechanism of what happens to those blood vessels in the back of the eye that we saw, what happens in the lens of the eye, and what's damaging nerves. Neuropathy is one of the consequences on that list. And the production of sorbitol, leading those neural cells to accumulate sorbitol in water, and then finally they have osmotic damage and those neurons are lost. But before they're lost, there's tingling, there's pain, there's burning sensation. When that sensation goes away, it's kind of like, uh-oh. So those are the two major mechanisms of how that damage comes about. So what's glycemic control, hyperglycemia, hypoglycemia? So here's, this page is like, gotta know this information forever. So your plasma glucose in a normal healthy person is generally regulated. You have about 70 milligrams to 100 milligrams of glucose in every 100 milliliters of blood. Now, there's another term for 100 milliliters of blood. It's called DL, or deciliter. So sometimes you'll see 70 milligrams per DL, and that's deciliter. And 1 deciliter is equal to 100 milliliters. And you can say blood or plasma in this case, and you're right. Sometimes you can't use that interchangeably. In this case, you can. So what's hypoglycemia? All of you have already had, before you came here, medical terminology, but all these words, you can break them down. So IA means condition of, and EM means blood. This means sugar. In this case, it means glucose. This means it's low. So it's a condition of low blood glucose. Hypoglycemia, low blood glucose, severe hypoglycemia leads to unconsciousness, brain and nerve damage, and can lead to death. Your brain, in a non-starving condition, needs 100 to 125 grams of glucose being presented to it every day. And that means 25% of your basal metabolic rate is supplying the energy for your brain and your spinal cord. So it has this absolute minute-by-minute need for glucose to keep things running. If your plasma glucose gets too low, and your brain's not getting enough glucose per minute or even per second of what it needs for basal maintenance, it can lead to all sorts of symptoms that the patient can report about how they're feeling, then unconsciousness. If hypoglycemia persists or becomes worse, it can lead to nerve damage and lead to death. Hyperglycemia, generally this takes longer for a problem to occur. This can happen within minutes. Bad things can happen. Hyperglycemia in most people, it's a longer term problem, although you are going to learn about hyperosmotic hyperglycemic syndrome, where a person becomes intracellularly dehydrated. But for most people, this chronic hyperglycemia, this leads to those things we just looked at. Advanced glycated end product and disordered polyol metabolism leading to damage to blood vessels and tissues throughout the body. And this usually takes years and sometimes decades to take place. So glycemic control is just another term for glucose homeostasis, and you know a lot about homeostasis already. You don't want something too high, you don't want something too low, you want it just right. And just right is that 70 to 100 milligrams. Now, insulin is the hormone, and this is as simple as you can make it. When you have, in a normal healthy person, the plasma glucose is elevated after eating that bagel with strawberry, no, I'm gonna go with raspberry now. With raspberry jam and drinking an orange juice, plasma glucose would go up. and insulin would be released, and insulin tells cells, there's glucose out here, bring the glucose into the cells, and then there's cellular glucose uptake due to insulin signaling. Now, glucagon just does the opposite. If we are hypoglycemic, pancreatic alpha cells will realize, oh, glucose is low, let's release glucagon, and glucagon goes out to cells throughout the body, including the liver. And what does it do with the liver? It functions to help raise plasma glucose. It tells the liver, release some of your stored break down your stored glycogen and release glucose into the bloodstream. And oh, by the way, and that's called glycogenolysis. And oh, by the way, make new glucose, and that's gluconeogenesis. And the liver will release that glucose into the bloodstream, restoring glucose back to normal. So insulin will take an elevated glucose and get it back down to normal. Glucagon will take plasma glucose that was too low and get it back up to normal. Okay? So here is a range for plasma glucose. Here in the green, this is good. Green's good in this case. Green's good. Yellow's kind of caution. Red, uh-oh, not good. So down here, below 70, a plasma glucose of below 70, that's hypoglycemia. And when patients are suffering hypoglycemia, when it gets below 70, most patients start feeling, oh, I'm sorry.
I was just going to ask, with hypoglycemia, does it become symptomatic? Would you have a low glucagon as well if you're symptomatic for hypoglycemia?
With hypo, we're kind of going to get to a little bit on that because I'm not quite sure how to answer it. Let's go through the whole regulation, then please ask that question later when we got a little bit more background, because what you're asking, I can say, yes, but, and I've got enough buts in my life to. Okay. So let's talk about being symptomatic due to hypoglycemia to begin with. And let's not worry just yet about how they became hypoglycemic. Okay? But early on, patients will feel shaky. They might report being dizzy, nauseated, sweaty. As the hypoglycemia gets worse, the symptoms become worse. Irritable, weak, they feel nervous, they feel headache. And generally, as it gets worse, the symptoms become more pronounced. And depending on which source, severe hypoglycemia either starts at 55, 50, or 45, okay? But once you get around 50 and you get below, you are in a very serious situation because you're going to start seeing neural dysfunction, loss of consciousness, seizure, coma, potentially death. This can happen pretty rapidly. Hypoglycemia can occur pretty rapidly in certain patients. And what you're going to find out and see is intensively managed diabetics, especially intensively managed diabetics, especially type 2 diabetics, that are on a number of medications to bring their glucose down. Believe it or not, they are susceptible to hypoglycemia. They're on so many medications to get their glucose down. If something out of the ordinary happens, an infection, anxiety, some types of metabolic challenge, they can actually dip too low. Okay? Now, hyperglycemia, when you're above, yes?
I was talking to a doctor and he was saying that for that it's usually a little bit safer to when you're doing glycemic control as a diabetic, it's a little bit safer to be on the upper end of the spectrum, because if you're controlling it too tight, then that can happen. Then
Yeah.
result can be death.
Results can be death. And in the last, that has always been the thought.
Okay.
And in the last several years, let's say 3 or 4 years, there have been more and more studies looking at what's called tight glycemic control.
Mm-hmm.
And it used to be, okay, let's control them about 150. And in the last number of years, they've tried to control them closer to 120, 110. And yes, it does decrease the progression of all those disease, but just what you said, the chance of hypoglycemia goes up. So you're walking on an edge of a razor blade. If you tightly control them, you're going to decrease chronic disease progression, but you're living with this scary situation right here.
Yeah, I mean, I know.
You're absolutely right. And for the last 3 years, there's been more and more big systemic reviews, and there have been big studies that have been completed looking at just what you're talking about. And it's a two-edged sword. It really
Yeah.
is.
I mean, I know someone who's really good at keeping, like, and I mean, he just the other day, like, had a seizure and
Yes.
and he like messed himself up, and my father-in-law, one of his
It's
medical
scary stuff.
medical friend, when they were in medical school, like, he died just a few years later from this.
Yeah, but here's controversy, here's intense discussion. This is intensely discussed about what should the appropriate target be? Because, this, having them here, and, I'm not gonna get into the clinical medicine part of it, but there is no doubt that if you control somebody here, there's less chance of getting here. If you control somebody here, it's cost benefit.
Mhm.
Cost, risk, in this case, it's risk benefit. It's risk benefit. But even though studies may show that there is a tremendous benefit for a certain type of control, everything is individual to the patient. And, that's where clinicians earn their stripes, with understanding this patient, I need to treat them this way.
So although the ideal is 100 to 70, like, I've had patients before that are still functioning very, very well at 34. And
At 34,
Mhm.
I've never heard of 34.
Oh, yeah, it shocked us.
I would, is that with multiple blood samples?
Because you're talking about a handheld glucometer. Once you get below 50, they're not accurate. So you have to have a serum.
At 45, I think people are moving.
See, but we've
They're not
had patients,
communicative.
we've had patients that are lower and it's just something that they've adjusted to it. And so as
I
far
would
as-
check the machine.
Yeah, there's in front of the hospital. There's,
I've never heard that. Wow, that blows me away. Wow.
So-
That's, normally you consider at 45, they're uncommunicative, and they're kind of, you're thinking they're looking at the tunnel, if you don't do something. Wow. So, once again, different patients are different, so those are the things you're gonna learn about when you're on your clinical rotations. Wow.
So my question with that is, has that person like reset their normal, so?
I would not, I can't even imagine how those people are functioning and being cognitively intact, because
You could tell that he was slowed.
because
Like his response
I
time
used-
and his question, like whenever you would ask him a question. So like we took it right away and then we ended up giving him B50 for it to get him back up, but yeah, he was still talking, he wasn't,
Wow.
you could tell that he definitely was impaired, but.
How long had it been that low? A while, you think?
No.
If it happened transiently, I can see it, but I mean, I would, wow. You're gonna learn a lot when you get into clinic. Okay, let's look at above. There's a gradual but progressive damage to blood vessels and tissues, and the severity is dependent on the duration, the degree of hyperglycemia. The longer a person's hyperglycemic, and sometimes we're talking decades, and the degree, more damage. And generally, hyperglycemic damage is slow, although you will learn about hyperosmotic, hyperglycemic syndromes where you have so much glucose in the bloodstream very quickly that water is drawn from cells into the bloodstream to dilute that glucose, and that leads to cellular dehydration, can lead to cellular dysfunction. So, let's look at what we briefly looked at in part one. Let's say, okay, I ate that bagel with, I'm going with apricot. Now, you can tell I'm kind of jonesing. Anyway, some orange juice. So you eat a high carbohydrate breakfast, and your plasma glucose goes up, and that's normal. That's typical. And now I don't want you to think that your beta cells wait until it's 140 before they sense an elevated plasma glucose. As soon as it gets, you're always, even when your plasma glucose is in the 70 to 100 region, you're releasing a small amount of insulin. It's just that as plasma glucose goes up, there's cells in your pancreas, the pancreatic beta cells, they have a glucostat, a glucose sensor, and they're constantly monitoring plasma glucose. And when plasma glucose is elevated above normal, they start releasing more and more and more insulin. So as those carbohydrates are being digested in the GI tract and glucose is being absorbed into the bloodstream, plasma glucose is going to go up. Those pancreatic beta cells that are sensing glucose, they will sense that elevation in plasma glucose, and that's going to stimulate those very same cells to cause the release of insulin. Those cells sense glucose in real time, 24/7, 365. They synthesize insulin, and they will release insulin in response to this hyperglycemia. That insulin is going to go through the bloodstream, throughout the body, and bind to insulin receptors, and many different tissues throughout the body have insulin receptors. But on a mass basis, your adipose tissue cells and your skeletal muscle cells form up the greatest mass of insulin-sensitive tissues in the body. By far the greatest mass of insulin-sensitive tissues. So when insulin binds the insulin receptor on those cells, those are called effector cells. It tells those cells, let's say adipose tissue and skeletal muscle, hey, there's glucose here in the circulation, because they don't have a glucostat, they don't know that. But insulin is telling them that. It's a communication molecule, and it's telling the interior of that cell, adipocytes and myocytes, what to do and when to do it. One of the things it's telling it to do is move a glucose transporter from your Golgi up to the surface to bring this glucose into the bloodstream. And I'll show you a picture of that. So insulin is going to stimulate the skeletal cells and the adipocytes to take up glucose. Plasma glucose is going to drop to 130. More glucose is going to be taken up, it's going to drop to 120. More glucose is going to be taken up, it'll drop down to 110. More glucose is going to be taken up, it's going to drop to 100. At that point, plasma glucose is normalized. Those sensors are going to be turned off, and that's negative feedback. Once this glucose returns to normal, the negative feedback is, okay, stop releasing insulin. Stop releasing insulin. Now we have the very same thing if plasma insulin is too low. Yes?
Is there like a hierarchy with the skeletal muscle and adipose like this?
Well,
is one more sensitive than the other?
It can be when it's dysfunctional, but think about blood flows going throughout the body.
Right.
And because you don't have portal circulations all throughout the body, if it goes past skeletal muscle first, if this glucose molecule happens to go past skeletal muscle first, it's going to be taken out.
Okay.
If it's going past adipocytes first, it will be taken out.
Because I guess I was sort of like, obesity is correlated with this, so I didn't know if, like,
See,
since there's so much extra glucose.
Let's get to the glucose transporter, and then I'm going to tell you about that. Because if somebody's been exercising, you're going to put more transporters on the surface of skeletal muscle.
Right.
So there's going to be more glucose being taken up by what were previously active muscle cells.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And so that's one of those, it depends situation. So if plasma glucose is decreased, you have sensors on your pancreatic alpha cells. And your alpha cells, interestingly, these sensors do not sense glucose very well at all. What do they actually sense? Insulin. In a normal, healthy person, when you have low glucose, what do you have for insulin? High or low? Low insulin. So if there's low insulin, these pancreatic alpha cells go, oh, well, insulin is low, glucose must be low. And that causes these pancreatic alpha cells, which make glucagon, to release glucagon. Glucagon is an endocrine hormone. It goes in the bloodstream, goes throughout the body. It will bind to glucagon receptors. And we have glucagon receptors all throughout the body. But here we're talking about maintenance of, or trying to get plasma glucose from being too low back to normal. If it binds receptors on the liver, on hepatocytes, these liver cells, that's going to stimulate those cells to break down stored glycogen. When you break down glycogen, it breaks it down to glucose. The glucose will go into the bloodstream. You're getting closer to normal. It can also stimulate those hepatocytes for gluconeogenesis. It can take non-carbohydrate precursors like many amino acids, glycerol, lactate, and use those carbons to make glucose molecules that's released into the bloodstream. And what's that going to do? Cause your plasma glucose to go back up. Once your glucose is normalized, insulin will be normalized. This shuts off. This shuts off. So you have bidirectional control of your plasma glucose, just like we saw with other homeostatic control mechanisms. So we have sensory effector, negative feedback loops, also called a reflex arc. Okay? And plasma glucose is just one of more than 200 different things that's regulated in your extracellular fluid by these sensory effector negative feedback loops bidirectionally. If something's too high, let's get it back down to normal. If it's something too low, let's get it back up to normal.
So, since pancreatic alpha cells, you said that they mostly have affinity for insulin, sensitivity for insulin cells. That means someone who's insulin dependent because they're not creating.
We will get to it.
Okay.
You're on to, and good. You guys are all three of those questions are dead on the money. And they're setting me up for what we're going to be talking about. Yeah. Now, we already talked about this early on. So most signs and symptoms of disease processes are really due to loss of homeostatic function. So, yeah, we're going to end up 5 minutes short here to get to where I wanted to stop, but that's okay. That's okay. We'll get there. So let's say this is your gut. This is your small intestine, where glucose is absorbed from your gut going into this. Is supposed to represent all of the circulation of your body. Here's pancreatic beta cells. Here's pancreatic alpha cells. This produces insulin. This produces glucagon. Here's effector cells. These are actually insulin-sensitive effector cells. This is supposed to be what a normal plasma glucose looks like. It's between 70 and 100. You might not know it looking at it, but let's say that that's what it is. So we're going to now look at, so pancreatic alpha cells, they actually, what we're going to look at is if plasma glucose drops too low. So with plasma glucose, the first thing we're going to do is look at if plasma glucose drops too low. It's lower than normal. So with plasma glucose, you can see that there's much less glucose. I'm a hell of an artist. In circulation, much lower glucose. Those pancreatic alpha cells are going to sense indirectly that hypoglycemia because if there's low glucose, there's going to be low insulin. And that's going to stimulate those pancreatic alpha cells to release glucagon into circulation. So, when glucagon binds glucagon receptors, this is supposed to, these glucose molecules linked together, is supposed to represent glycogen. It will tell that cell to start breaking down glycogen, and that glucose will go into circulation. And also it'll tell those hepatocytes to start synthesizing new glucose by gluconeogenesis. So that's what happens. So you have glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis. And this is, I think, the slide that you got. When plasma glucose is low, glucagon is released and it functions to increase plasma glucose. That's what you have, right? Something close to this one?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Now, pancreatic alpha cells sense plasma glucose actually via insulin. Now, this becomes very important later on. Very, very important. So, let's say we have an elevation in plasma glucose. What happens? And so we're going to kind of step through this, but so we're going to get to an elevated plasma glucose here. I forgot I had these set. So we are becoming hyperglycemic here. Normal is 70 to 100, but first we're just going to look at normal. I kind of forgot what order I put things. So we have the sensors up there, we have the effectors up there. So this is just putting in this picture, which we're going to use later, of normal glucose regulation. So when we sense glucose in circulation, if it's getting just above normal, we're going to have a release of insulin from pancreatic beta cells. They sense and they synthesize and they release. That insulin's going to go throughout circulation, and there's actually insulin receptors on cells throughout the body. But once again, on the mass, for the mass of it, your adipocytes and skeletal muscle are by far the greatest contributors of insulin-sensitive cells. So here I have insulin binding a membrane surface receptor. It's going to turn on, if you remember back when, it's going to activate a tyrosine kinase that activates a membrane signal transduction process. And it tells many cells in the body a lot of things, what to do and when to do and how much to do. But what we're looking at right here, this green thing, happens to be a glucose transporter. It's called a GLUT4, a glucose transporter 4. And your insulin-sensitive cells in a normal, healthy person has extra ones that it has sitting so, it's like sitting on the sidelines in your Golgi apparatus. They're just sitting in your Golgi, and what happens when insulin binds its receptor, it signals those GLUT4 glucose transporters to come up here to the surface of the membrane, and that glucose transporter allows glucose to come in going down its chemical concentration range. Glucose can't go through the membrane by itself. It needs to have a plasma protein. A GLUT4 is a glucose transporting plasma protein. So, insulin, when it binds insulin-sensitive cells with GLUT4, glucose transporters, insulin signals that cell to bring the GLUT4 up to the surface, and that is what's causing the insulin-induced glucose uptake in your skeletal muscle and adipocytes. So more and more glucose is going to come in. Plasma glucose will go down to normal. So insulin binds an insulin receptor. Insulin signals GLUT4 to translocate from the Golgi to the cell membrane. Plasma glucose in your cells moving down its chemical concentration gradient. And I think this is the slide I gave you. It's going through circulation. So that's kind of putting in pictures that diagram. So